Welcome to Dark Minds, Stories of Serial Killers. I'm Victoria, and here we delve into some of the darkest minds in history. Today, we explore the chilling case of Dennis Rader, known as the BTK Killer. Death, bind, torture, kill. For nearly 2 decades, Rader terrorized Wichita, Kansas, living a double life as a family man and community leader, while secretly committing horrendous crimes. In this episode, we will uncover how this man's mind operated, and how the trust of an entire community was shattered by his presence. If dark stories like this captivate you, and spark your curiosity about the mysteries of the human mind, be sure to like, comment, and share. Your interaction helps us keep the lessons and reflections from these cases alive. Subscribe to Dark Minds to follow more stories that reveal the darkest and most disturbing aspects of human nature. What drives a person to live a double life, carrying a mask of normalcy while hiding deadly impulses? Dennis Rader, the BTK Killer, embodied this duality in a way few would have imagined. For nearly 2 decades, he transformed his need for control into a sadistic game, in which his victims were mere pieces manipulated in a carefully crafted scene. He followed, observed, and studied his victims' routines with a detached, calculated approach he called his study. Over those years, the name BTK became synonymous with panic in Wichita, where families who once felt safe began locking doors and watching over their shoulders. Rader was no stranger. He was a familiar face in the community, a church member and compliance officer. This contrast between his public life and private horror made his crimes even more disturbing, leaving scars on all who lived under his shadow. In the 1970s, Wichita was a quiet city, a place where everyone knew each other and trust was deeply ingrained. The arrival of a series of violent murders shattered that security. The BTK's initial crimes displayed a brutality and coldness that challenged everyone's sense of normalcy. Dennis Rader, working as a compliance officer, held a position of authority that allowed him to access people's lives in a legitimate, trusted way. He used this role to maintain public order, while privately, he was setting his sights on unsuspecting victims. Wichita was experiencing growth, but with each murder, fear replaced the peace, and the community's very identity was reshaped by an atmosphere of paranoia. To understand Dennis Rader, we have to go back to his childhood, a period when he began to exhibit disturbing signs. Rader was born into a middle-class family and appeared to have a normal upbringing. However, behind this facade, he displayed troubling behaviors early on. As a young boy, he confessed to deriving pleasure from harming small animals, hinting at impulses that would intensify over time. This dark practice was only the beginning of a need for control that, over the years, would turn into an uncontrollable urge. Psychologists would later describe Rader as having traits of psychopathy and extreme narcissism, a man who saw himself above others and refused to consider the consequences of his actions. At home, he grew up in a structured and religious environment, but his mind was already being shaped by violent impulses he could not control. What is most terrifying about Dennis Rader is the meticulous precision and obsession with control he exercised over his victims. Each crime was a ritual planned down to the smallest detail. Rader called himself BTK, bind, torture, kill, a name that accurately described his methods. He chose victims he perceived as vulnerable and focused on his need for dominance. Women alone, unsuspecting families, children living with their parents. He followed their routines, catalogued their movements, and with a chilling calm, invaded their homes, turning the safest place into a scene of horror. For him, each murder was not just an act but a source of gratification derived from his total control over life and death. Rader's approach combined direct action with ritualistic cruelty. First, he subdued his victims, neutralizing any resistance. Then he bound them, feeding off the sense of total power he held over them. He knew that in those moments he alone could decide their fate. His cold detachment, his view of victims as projects to be completed, underscores his lack of empathy. He studied his victims as objects, and their death, to him, was merely a way to fulfill a dark need. This cycle of violence turned Wichita into a community on high alert. Families who once felt secure now felt fear creeping into every locked door. Over the years, Dennis Rader showed a remarkable ability to evade the police. He not only manipulated the investigations, but also toyed with the very system meant to catch him. He took extreme care with details, avoiding direct contact with victims before his attacks, making it difficult for detectives to establish connections. Rader maintained his distance, using his anonymity as a source of power, growing his sense of control by knowing he was causing fear without being discovered. Each act seemed to add to his aura of mystery, while detectives found themselves endlessly chasing shadows. As a compliance officer, Rader projected an image of authority and even respectability. His role allowed him access to data and an intimate view of community life, which in some cases helped him select victims. This job added another layer of control, where he could enforce rules in the community by day, while secretly preying on it by night. This control over his image allowed him to go undetected for years. When Dennis Rader was finally arrested in 2005, the revelation was shocking for everyone who knew him. The man who sat among them at church, attended community events, and enforced rules as a compliance officer, was the same person who had terrorized Wichita as BTK. At his trial, Rader displayed a chilling detachment, discussing his crimes with a coldness that made his lack of empathy painfully clear. He described his steps, each murder carried out as if part of a calculated plan. For the victims' families, the trial was agonizing, as Rader spoke of their loved ones as mere objects of his obsession with control. Rader received 10 consecutive life sentences, with no possibility of parole. Though he sought attention, he now lives in isolation in a maximum security prison, destined to be forgotten. Yet, the scars he left on Wichita remain indelible. BTK not only took lives but also forever altered the sense of safety in his community. A reminder that beneath the most ordinary facade can lie the darkest of evils.